Yeah, I say there's relationship with in-laws without children, and then relationship with in-laws with
changes
children,
everything.
and the intensity cranks up.
Defining and that the couple is aligned, that they have a strong foundation and boundary, and that's what they present to each families. And then it goes to working on your own individual relationships with all the family members.
Welcome to the Me and Us podcast, a conversation between two relationship therapists who talk about real-life issues based on what they learn in a clinical setting, working with clients, and from their own experiences of motherhood, marriage, and parenting.
Hello, welcome to the Me and Us podcast. I am Dr. Olivia, and with me is Elsa.
Hello.
And today we are talking about in-laws, and I just left it at that title, right? It speaks for itself.
Jinx. It does. I think in-laws are such a complex and dynamic relationship because it isn't just about the in-laws. It's about the in-laws and your partner and you.
Yeah. And it brings in the whole family.
Yeah.
And, I think there are so many dynamics going on with in-laws. And yeah, I mean, for me, I would say in my practice, it's really something that comes up quite a bit. Sometimes specifically, people come in for that.
Absolutely.
And what I would say, generally speaking, it's about something that's not working, negative,
Negative.
either. Often when there's children involved, I think that's when things really change and get intense.
The intensity, right. The intensity changes once you have children, I think.
But I mean, what would you say? I mean, I don't want to be specific, but oftentimes it is mother-in-law with sons. I would say that's an intense one.
So where the wife comes in complaining about the mother-in-law of a son. Correct.
Yeah.
That's a dynamic that I see really often. What do you make of it?
Well, I think it depends on the intensity and nature of the relationship between the mother and son. If it's firstborn son, if it's the only son, then that child becomes very important to the mother. And
yes,
I think when, another person comes into the relationship, there's a threat. There's a threat to that relationship. It's natural. And I think it's not something, I think it's natural for that to happen, right?
And I think sometimes there is kind of like a silent fear. Well, sometimes I guess it's not that silent, but this isn't always the case. But I think culturally we expect the women to remain connected to her family of origin, but less so of the man. Like it is common to see that the man lost contact with his family and kept more contact with the woman's family.
I think that's so often the case,
right.
Which I see.
And so there's this
even in my own family,
greater threat that like the man will forget about their parents, therefore bringing that intensity and that anxiety of like loss to like the mother-son dynamic and the wife becoming like an intruder or somebody who's snatching him away.
Yeah.
I don't always think it's the case, but I think that this tension plays like silently. In the background.
Well, and I think it's the role of the woman often, if we're speaking about heterosexual relationships, I think the woman has a closer connection to her own family. The woman is the one who, writes the thank you cards or, thinks of the birthdays and sends gifts to everybody. And I think the woman often sort of has more of a connection, to her family, but I think sometimes the man will, sort of join that and often like has a closer relationship to the spouse or the partner's family. And because I think generally speaking, women make more effort in little things versus men, they don't like call as much. They don't think of certain things that maybe the woman takes on. Yes. And sometimes, there's a shift where there's a closer connection to the partner's family, and that is a threat to his family, especially, with mothers, I would say more.
Yes.
So,
But I think, there's so much variability there. I know that I married into a family that has 3 sons. And my husband always let me know, my parents are going to be important and equal participants. So I knew walking into this relationship that they were going to be part of my life. And in fact, I think in the first few years, we got into a lot of trouble, both of us trying to make sure that we were being very even. Because in my family, I think my dad spent more time with with my mother's side, like the typical dynamic. And we chose for that not to be the case, but it took a lot of effort. So we kind of found ourselves like measuring too much, more than was useful. Both of us kind of like advocating
right.
for
It becomes a
the evenness,
competition in a way, which I
even
think
though
is very true.
we both wanted it to be even, but it got us it took away some just like natural relaxed behaviors. It was very rigid because we just wanted to make sure it was so even.
Do you think, so I'm curious, do you think that is specific to your culture too? Because I
It could
know,
be.
Venezuelan communities are very tight knit, and families as well. So I'm
Yes.
just curious if that is, do you think that is part of the culture that both your families are pretty important and there's
I
close
think so.
contact?
I think so. I mean, I know that we are in contact not just with our parents, but with our grandparents and cousins and extended family.
Right.
So there is a lot of like commitment to that larger network.
It takes work too. I
It
mean, I
takes
think that
work.
takes effort, and which is not always the case in a lot of
In other
families.
cultures. Yeah.
So I think there's both. Absolutely. I think
Mhm.
it can be a competition in a way. I also think of it as like, sometimes I like to say, looking at it as like having one foot in your family and one foot in the marriage and
Mhm.
one foot in the other person's family and in the marriage. And I see that often. And
Yeah.
that it becomes more of a competition, and there's a loyalty, a very strong
Mhm.
loyalty to each of their own families, right? Which then
Like it or not.
can affect the couple so much.
So much. And I think me and my husband really struggled with this because, like it or not, you do start to leave the nest. And I mean, I was totally independent by the time I met my husband and married him. To some degree, I like to think about it as like, who's your emergency contact? Before my husband, it was my parents. And then at some point, it was my husband. And that shift is indicative of like where our energy, where our alliances end up resting. Like, who is your number one go-to person? And there is a time where like that may shift and move from being your parents to your significant other. And so I think it took us a while to just feel more comfortable focusing on ourselves and what we wanted and less on like making our presence even with our parents. I think we also ended up having better relationships with our in-laws and with each other once we started feeling more relaxed with just focusing on us. We didn't lose contact, but it was just our stance and our perspective evolved and matured, I think.
I had a more challenging relationship in the beginning with my mother-in-law. And I think, I was much younger at the time. And I think now I can look at it and see it differently or with more perspective, also from a therapeutic, lens, that when I came into the picture, I was a threat to my mother-in-law because I was, taking away her favorite son, her favorite child, who was very important to her. And it just resulted in a lot of tension, intensity in the early years. But I always tell my clients, like, it doesn't always have to stay like that, because I have actually a really wonderful relationship with her now and have had for many, many years. And I think that's a beautiful thing, and to me, and I think part of what has made that is, in my family at least, my grandmothers were very important to me. My grandfathers as well, but they died when I was very young. So the female figure was always very important in my family.
Yes.
I loved both my grandmothers so much so. And when I had children, like, to me, it was very important that they had good relationships with their grandmothers, and so I really wanted to encourage that for my children, because I think in some cases it doesn't look like that.
The opposite
And to
almost.
me, I really wanted them to have a good relationship. And it turned out my mother-in-law is like an amazing grandmother. That helped.
Of
And
course.
it just, helped make that relationship close. But I think that especially, what I see in practice is where when children come into the picture, it can be very
Yes.
much
Yeah, I say there's relationship with in-laws without children, and then relationship with
and it
in-laws with
changes
children, and
everything.
the intensity cranks up. But I love how when you decided to focus on what an important role a grandmother has, there was interest for the relationship to be really great. And sometimes I find it's the opposite. People will see it as a competition, like
Right.
who's going to win, mother or grandmother.
Right. And it was on both sides on my case because my mother-in-law was very interested in having a relationship with my children.
Mm-hmm.
And, which is not always the case.
Right.
And I was interested. So it just worked. We wanted to foster that. But I see that very much, not the case in couples who have issues with in-laws, where then, it becomes a thing like, oh, she's trying to parent my children, or she gives them chocolate when I said she shouldn't give them chocolate, those kinds of things. And
I think, I think that people get into that a lot when the grandmother conceptualizes the relationship with the grandchild as separate from everything else that's going on in the family. And there can be like a lot of intrusion and a lot of boundary breaking. And if the mother is feeling entirely disregarded in that dynamic, it'll usually lead to a lot of trouble. So I think, it requires intelligence for the grandmother to be free to play that role that they may want to play with their grandkids, because I think it is a different role than the one the mother or the father plays.
Absolutely.
But it takes intelligence. If you just go like blazing through, all the rules and just breaking them and being like, I say so and I do whatever I want, there's going to be trouble.
Well, and I think a very important thing with in-laws is our boundaries. And I think that needs to be set from the get-go.
Yeah.
Because I think if and the couple, needs to be somewhat on the same page on this, and they need to be aligned that this is about the couple defining, what are those relationships going to look like? How much do we see our in-laws? How much, do we want them over? How much time do we spend vacation with them? Like those things need to be defined, and then that needs to be presented to both sides of the family, right? And how do you balance that?
Because I'll tell you why I'm asking this question. I think some of the things that get most of my couples into a lot of trouble is when the line of communication is through the son or daughter of the in-laws. So here I am thinking all of these things and wanting all of these rules and boundaries, and I need to tell my husband to tell it to his parents. And when that dynamic establishes itself, that's just like a recipe for disaster. Because I think that a true relationship with in-laws is the one where they will want to speak to one another. That the child-in-law and the parent-in-law will converse with each other and have an open line of communication.
Well, I think that's a huge thing that comes up in therapy. And that's why every time I'll immediately draw a triangle and the family, diagram on my wall for them to visualize it and see it. But I think this communication, where the other spouse is supposed to communicate with their parents, because these are your parents, so you need to talk to them and communicate this, is setting up the spouse who needs to communicate up for disaster. And so I like to always look at it as like working on your own communication with your in-laws. Like you have, just because this is the son or daughter and this is their family, you can have a relationship with their parents, right? You need to communicate, you need to talk, versus like funneling it through the other spouse, which never works. And it sets up that, because that person's in the middle. They get caught.
And being in the middle is literally between a rock and a hard place, and nobody thrives in that position. So I think, I struggle with that personally, having a direct line of communication, and I've come to understand it. I mean, we talk all the time, but I struggle to have a direct conversation when things are more difficult or anxious, or when the message is not nice. But I've come to understand that challenge as coming from like really caring for the other person. So wanting to have that good relationship, I care deeply for my mother-in-law, and sometimes not wanting to offend or say something difficult results in some distance, and that's when my husband gets dragged into the
By you then,
triangle
because
by
you,
me. And that's something that I've worked on doing less and less of. How can I really just take what I'm thinking, and if I want that close communication, closeness can only come if I approach
Right.
the difficult moments.
well,
And that
is
has
your
been such a struggle.
experience that it hasn't worked so well? If that, if you're bringing
Yes.
your anxiety and it's uncomfortable, but you're bringing it then to your spouse, who then has to like
Manage it.
manage it, that it doesn't work so well. That needs work, and I mean, definitely something I address in therapy, because I think that's really big when it comes to in-laws.
Yes. And going back to this concept that we were talking about the daughter-in-law stealing the son away from the parents, if you get into this dynamic where the son becomes the speaker for the wife to the parents, you're reinforcing that. Like, here I am talking to you in a way that you, my mom or dad, don't recognize, because it's not my message, it's my wife's, and I'm aligning with her. And
but I think you can also see the opposite, where the spouse becomes very passive and they actually don't do anything. And then
Yes.
it results in tension between the couple, because then the other
where
person
is your
is going,
alliance?
yeah, right, you're not supporting me, you're not standing up for me. And it's, again, they're so caught in the middle, and it becomes about having to choose your loyalty. And
if you're there, it's a lose-lose situation. Let's just get clear. If you're stuck in the middle, it's a lose-lose situation. So I think the way out is for each person to relate one-on-one.
Well, and I think for the couple, I think that's sort of that defining, and that the couple is aligned, that they have a strong foundation and boundary, and that's what they present to each families, and it has to be fair, it has to be balanced. But I think it starts there, with the couple having to, and then it goes to working on your own individual relationships with all the family members, right?
Yes.
With your in-laws, with your parents.
And one thing that I want to say is that often we talk about the in-laws as a unit, but the in-laws are really two people.
Of
Not in every
course, yeah.
case, but most times there is, a mother-in-law and a father-in-law. And that's something that I've worked on to kind of like make that separation. And see, like, how do I relate to my father-in-law and how do I relate to my mother-in-law? Because I think that there's like a lot of subtleties and beauty that can come from like really nourishing those relationships individually and see them as separate, because ultimately they are.
Well, and I think especially if they're divorced, for example,
Yeah.
it's a whole nother layer of, if one is more, sort of on the outside, depending on how they're looked at by the ex-spouse and the children, and it becomes challenging, maybe where that relationship is more distant. And I think you have to, as the spouse, sort of be more objective about that and be more neutral. And for example, in my husband's family, like the mother, my husband has a much closer relationship with his mother, like more contact, and we go stay at her house, we stay, so it automatically puts more distance with his father. And instead of, siding with everybody else, I've really had to, and for me, it's easier because I'm not part of that family. Like I can be more objective, right? Because
Okay.
I'm joining that family. But I think working on my relationship with my father-in-law was very important, to be present there, and which was really possible for me because I was not part of all that other stuff that
so
they
you had a
have. And
very direct kind of like
easier,
road
but there were
to-
lots of triangles, and I have to always make sure I stay in my lane, or out, or not get triangulated right in
Yes.
those. But I think that's just another layer if there is divorce or remarriages.
Yeah, no, this makes me think, because I'm always talking to clients about relationship with in-laws, and it's one that I take seriously and think about for personally as well. But I think what makes it such a topic that in-laws speaks for itself is that it's a relationship that usually starts in adulthood, but it comes with so much history and intensity from being a part of someone else's life forever. So when you enter a family, you're new to it entirely, but there's this expectation for closeness and to like and for belonging and for deep connection. I mean, depending on what you want for your family and your connection to your parents, but oftentimes you are kind of like thrown into all of these dynamics that have been established for years. And so it really oftentimes I hear people describing it as feeling like there's just so much pressure to perform a certain way and to belong a certain way and to have this closeness, but you are just starting to develop this relationship. And I don't think that many people take the time to get to know their daughter-in-law, their son-in-law, their father and mother-in-law one-on-one as adults. Like, who are you? How do I get to know
Mhm.
you? It's just like, these are my parents.
Right.
And
Right.
make something of that, right? So I think that speaks to the nature of the complexity. You start a relationship that starts with all of this history and all of these other dynamics attached to it.
Right. And I think it varies among families. I
Yes.
think it's some in some families, I think there's more openness to sort of get to know the person coming in. There's more interest, there's more
Hmm.
curiosity versus in others not. But I think it also depends on the relationship of the spouse that the spouse has with or the partner with their own
Hmm.
families. I
Yes.
think that also plays a role in, like, you know, the new person coming in,
Hmm.
and what is that going to look like then,
Yes.
and so it's
As soon as you
it's
said, sorry, go for
not,
it.
no, I think in-laws is I think it can be beautiful relationships that you can have with your in-laws, but I think it's complex, and I think
It
that
is.
sometimes it's challenging.
I have a client recently that I was talking to about like how do you envision parenthood and becoming a father, and he said that one of the things that comes to mind when he thinks of that is thinking about like his village, the family that he will bring to the child um, as a gift. And I thought that was such a beautiful way to think about it. And I do think that having grandparents is about as good a resource as a child can have. And I've had incredible support from my
Mhm.
father and mother in law. So I think that with intelligence and effort, it can be a very fulfilling relationship. But
It
it's
can,
certainly
but
one that is very difficult to get right without being mindful about it. I think it is very easy to get caught up in criticism and feeling, you know, trespassed and like they've not respecting
yeah,
and
which
pressured,
happens,
and
which
it
does happen.
happens,
There's no
right?
boundaries, and there's sort of like, oh, you know, my child is still part of my family, and so, but that's not the case, right? There shouldn't be. There should be a separation where this person then starts a new family,
Hmm.
right? And I think that's sort of, there has to be a
Yeah.
separation, an individuation, or boundaries, because I think there's also lots of disappointment that comes with it. I think especially when there's children involved, where people have an expectation of what their in-laws are going to be and what role they're going to have
Hmm.
with their children, and that doesn't play out that way. And
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of disappointment.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that brings people to therapy, because they have to process that
Hmm.
was a letdown. They're not as available, they don't
Yes.
help out, they don't support, and
And the same
it,
is true in the other direction. I think a lot of what gets people, in laws and children in law, in trouble is when there is a parent who has very specific expectations for their child and who they marry. Essentially, if you are not confident in your child's ability to be an independent adult and marry the right person, and if you're just always judging and trying to like parent them or control what they do or don't do, that will be communicated, even if silently or directly,
oh
into
yeah.
the relationship. And then, like, you're really not respecting your own child and much less their new partner. And that's just a terrible setup. But I will
Yep.
say, as an idea, I just noticed we've been talking about parents in law, and we need to talk in a future episode about Siblings in law. That's a
I
whole
know
other topic
we didn't even touch on that. Yes,
that I'm
it's.
excited to think about because it's.
I mean, think about like that's why I always have to draw it and visualize it because there's just so many dynamics going on, so many relationships.
Yes.
And these two families, coming together. I always look at it as like family A, family B, and then you're creating family C. And what are you bringing in from each of these families and what are you letting go,
Oh, I
and
like
what are
that
you
part. What are
creating
you letting
new?
go?
So I think,
Yes.
yeah, there's
We'll
so
get
much.
there.
We'll get there. And, we have some questions.
Yes, we do.
I am asking if you took your in-law out of the context of in-law in your family, how would you see them as a person outside of that context? Would you relate to them differently? And if yes, how so? And what I'm asking is to sort of think of your in-law or in-laws as individuals, as people on their own, without being in the context of your family, how would you relate to that person? Because I think you can look at that person, in an adult way, very differently, without all this other stuff, as just people. And what's different then? How do you
Yes.
relate to that person? What do you see versus just seeing them through the lens of like, in-law?
I will just respond by saying, whoopsies. I think my first question is almost the same as yours. And it's like, have you gotten to know your in-laws as adults? As different from the role of your partner's parent and as different from the role of your grandparents, your children's grandparents. And I think we're going to the same place, which is like, I think if you're stuck in seeing how they act as an in-law or as a parent or as a grandparent, you can easily lose sight of the fact that this person is an individual. And I think, again, if you're trying to get to know that person, you can work through some of the tensions that may be
it's a
taking
more
place.
mature relationship. And I think that is something that, I talk to clients about with their parents, to get to know your parents as people and as, grown-ups versus just as your parent. And I think that's a very different relationship versus as seeing them as a child with, all the things that, they did right or wrong and getting to know them.
And
as
I guess
people.
in trying not to copy you entirely and just add more dimension to that question, to that great question that you asked, I'm thinking about also, have you taken an opportunity to let your in-laws know who you are as an adult, as separate from a mother or a wife, right? Because I think back to like this silence of like, tell your parents this or tell your grandparents that. And it's like, how do you take an opportunity to let them know who you are? Like, who did your child marry?
So important.
Yeah.
Equally as important. And that's the work, I think, that, the work you do on yourself on those individual relationship, which really is about sharing more about yourself, who are you? And that's what you're communicating.
Yes.
And that's very important. Yep.
Okay.
My other question is, what makes in-laws or in-law relationships often complicated? List 3 specific things you are confronted with in the triangle with your partner and in-law or in-laws, depending.
Yeah.
What are, just to sort of define more, what's going on? What's complicated?
Yeah.
What are specific things that you would, sort of point to?
I love that exercise. And I think that if people can answer that exercise by also seeing how they respond. So for example, like when my mother-in-law does this, this happens to me or I feel this way. And then I usually will then go and tell this to my husband. So like to try and track what is that thing that is making the relationship complicated. Because normally I'll just hear people say like, oh, my father-in-law is this way and my mother-in-law did that. And it stops at that.
And I think that helps also, that observation and sort of tracking helps you understand the reciprocity in relationships, the back and forth, and what, this is not just an individual, this is a relationship system, and each person plays a part in it. And what part do you play in it?
And I think that is people's biggest challenge when I hear them talk about children-in-law or parents-in-law, is that they can only really see the role the other is playing, and they have a very hard time seeing how they contribute to that
Yes.
dynamic.
I mean, I think that's, when we're anxious, we focus on other people. We lose sight of really, what's going
role.
on with us, or trying to change our own selves. So we focus on other people. I think that, but it's good. It's a good reminder.
So with my next question, I'm going to force people to look at themselves. And it's how many relationships do you feel a sense of closeness to that comes from criticizing your in-laws?
I love that question.
Some may think like, really, maybe just one. There's this friend I talk to, but I think if you think further, you'll be like, oh, and then this and this and this.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, we get, comfort in that's the triangle.
Venting
We
and
pull and
gossiping.
gossiping and pulling in somebody else to calm our own anxiety. And that can be a specific person. It can be multiple people. But I think that's a great question to think about.
Put a number on it. All right. Well, this was awesome. I look forward to the sibling-in-law discussion.
We're gonna do that. And please email us at themeandus@gmail.com. Got it right this time?
I think it might be the Me and Us podcast at gmail.com.
What did I say?
The Me and Us at gmail.com.
Yeah. I'll get it right next time. And looking forward to our next conversation, Elsa.
Yes. Thank you.